For 30 years, the Alpha King of Eldmoor was a ruthless, untouchable monster, locked inside a fortress of his own grief. But his reign almost ended on a freezing morning in the Thornwood, when he woke up beaten, bound to a tree, and left for dead. He braced himself for the assassin's final strike. Instead, a 6-year-old girl in a patched dress stepped out of the morning mist. She didn't scream. She didn't run from the blood. Instead, the poor maid's daughter reached up to the most dangerous man alive, touched his scarred face, and did something so unexpected it would shatter his 30-year curse and change the fate of the entire kingdom forever.
The mist lay thick over the Thornwood forest that morning, pale and quiet as a held breath. Deep among the ancient oaks, where the roots broke through the earth like the knuckles of sleeping giants, a man was tied to a tree. The rope bit into his wrists, coarse and unforgiving. His head hung low, dark hair matted with dew and a thin trickle of blood from a cut above his brow. His tunic was torn at the shoulder, and the leather bindings around his chest had been pulled so tight that every breath came shallow and ragged. He had been there for hours, maybe longer, long enough that the cold had seeped through his clothes and settled into his bones like a tenant that refused to leave. He heard a voice before he saw her, a small voice, thin and bright, cutting through the fog like a thread of gold. "Mama says mushrooms grow where the mist is thickest." The man lifted his head, slow and heavy, and squinted through the gray. A child stood a few paces away, a small woven basket hooked over one arm. She wore a patched woolen dress the color of dried heather, and her deep gold curls escaped from under a frayed linen cap in every direction. Her eyes were wide, blue-gray like the sky before rain, and her cheeks were scattered with freckles that looked like a careless sprinkle of cinnamon. She tilted her head, studying him the way one might study a strange bird that had landed on a windowsill. "You are tied up," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the calm certainty of a child who had not yet learned that the world was full of dangerous things. The man said nothing. His jaw was clenched, and his gray-blue eyes, sharp even in the dim light, watched her with the wary stillness of a wolf that had been caught in a trap. The child stepped closer. Her sole boots made soft sounds on the damp leaves. "Does it hurt?" He could have lied. He was a man who had lied many times in his life, to enemies and allies alike, with equal ease. But something about the way she asked, not with pity, not with fear, but with plain, unadorned curiosity, made the words stick in his throat. He nodded. Just once. The girl set down her basket and walked right up to him. She was small enough that the top of her head barely reached his chest. She reached up, and with a gentleness that seemed far too old for her 6 years, she touched the cut above his brow with the tips of her fingers. "You are bleeding," she said. "Mama says blood should stay inside. It is not for outside." Despite everything, the cold, the ropes, the fury that had been simmering in his chest since he woke to find himself trussed like a deer, the man felt something crack, just a little, in the wall around his heart. "Your mama sounds wise," he rabbited. His voice was hoarse from disuse and the gag that had been stuffed into his mouth for most of the night. "She is the wisest," the girl agreed. "She knows everything. She knows which berries are poison and which ones are only pretending to be poison. She knows how to make soup from a turnip and a prayer. And she knows that mist makes mushrooms grow." She paused, then added as if offering a great secret, "That is why we are here. For mushrooms. For the soup." The man almost smiled. Almost. "What is your name?" he asked. "Anne," she said it proudly, puffing out her small chest. "Annabelle, but everyone calls me Anne. What is your name?" He opened his mouth and the lie came easily, smoothly, the way it always did. "I am a merchant, a trader of wool and leather. My name is—" But before he could finish, a new voice cut through the mist. "I am a merchant, a trader of wool and leather. My name is—" But before he could finish, a new voice cut through the mist. "File!" Older, threaded with alarm. Anne, where are you?" The girl turned, and the man felt a stab of something he had not felt in 30 years. Fear. Not for himself. For her. For this strange, fearless little creature who had wandered up to a bound stranger in the middle of a forest. "Here, Mama," Anne called. There is a man tied to a tree, and he is bleeding, and I think he needs soup." The man closed his eyes. Of course she would say exactly that. The woman who emerged from the mist a moment later was not what he expected. She was tall for a woman, but slender, with work-roughened hands and a face that had known hardship but not been defeated by it. Her hair was the color of flax, pulled back into a loose knot at the nape of her neck, and her eyes were the warm brown of autumn oak leaves. She wore a patched woolen dress, much like her daughter's, a worn shawl over her shoulders, and her boots were cracked from years of walking. She stopped when she saw him. Her hand went to the small knife at her belt, not a weapon he could tell, a tool for cutting herbs and mushrooms, and her eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "A merchant," he said, "attacked by thieves on the road. They took my horse, my coin, and left me here to die. It was a good lie. It had the ring of truth, the flavor of a story that happened often enough in these troubled times." But the woman's eyes did not soften. "Thieves," she repeated. "In the Thornwood? They would have to be desperate or foolish. This is the king's forest. Perhaps they were both." She studied him for a long moment. Her gaze traveled over his torn tunic, the fine wool of his cloak, the leather of his boots, goods that did not match the story of a simple wool merchant. He saw her notice, and he saw her decide with the quiet pragmatism of a woman who had learned to trust her instincts, not to press the question. "Mama," Anne said, tugging at her mother's sleeve. "He is bleeding, and he is cold. We have soup at home." The woman looked down at her daughter, then back at him. Something passed across her face, a flicker of weariness, perhaps, or the memory of a kindness she had once received and never forgotten. "Can you walk?" she asked. He tested his legs. They were stiff, numb from the cold and the hours of immobility, but they held when he pushed himself upright against the tree. The ropes had been loosened by the girl, clever little fingers working at the knots while her mother stood watch, and now hung loose around his wrists. "I can walk," he said. "Then walk. My cottage is a mile south of the village. You can rest there, and we will see to your wounds." She paused, and her voice took on a harder edge. "But I want you to understand something, merchant. I am a widow with one child. I have nothing worth stealing, and I have seen enough of the world to know when a man is trouble. If you bring trouble to my door, I will not hesitate to turn you out into the cold." He looked at her for a long moment. There was no fear in her eyes, no pretense, just the steady, unblinking watchfulness of a woman who had learned that the world did not give without taking, and that the only safety she could count on was the safety she built with her own 2 hands. "I understand," he said. She nodded once and turned. "Come then. Anne, take his other side. He looks like he might fall." Anne, who had been hopping from foot to foot with barely contained excitement, slipped under his arm as if she had been doing it her whole life. Her small hand found his, and "Think," squeezed it, with a confidence that startled him. "Do not worry," she said, looking up at him with those blue-gray eyes. "Mama's soup is the best in the world. It will fix you right up." And because he could think of nothing else to say, because he was a man who had faced down armies and assassins and had never once been at a loss for words, William of House Thornwood, the Alpha King of Eldmoor, said, "I am sure it will." The walk to the cottage was slow, the mist curling around them like a living thing. The man leaned more heavily on the child than he wanted to, but she did not complain. She chattered instead, filling the silence with a stream of observations and questions that tumbled over each other like water over stones. "Have you ever seen a dragon?" "No. They are real," she said confidently. "Old Marta says so. She says they used to live in the mountains, and their teeth fall out and turn to stone. I have one." She let go of his hand for a moment to dig in her pocket, then produced a small, oddly shaped gray stone. "See? It is a dragon tooth. It is lucky. Do you want it?" He looked down at the stone in her grubby palm. It was just a stone, ordinary and unremarkable. But the way she held it, the way she offered it with such open-handed generosity, made it seem like the most precious thing in the world. "Keep it," he said. "It is yours. It would not be lucky if I took it from you." She considered this, then nodded solemnly. "You are right. Lucky stones do not like to be traded. But I will show it to you later. if you want. I would like that. Ahead, the woman, Anne's mother, led the way, her back straight, her pace steady. She did not look back, but he could feel her attention on him, a constant, watchful presence. She was afraid, he realized. Not of him precise, but for her daughter, for the fragile little world she had built around herself and this child. And she had still let him come. He did not know what to make of that. He had spent 30 years learning to trust no one, to keep everyone at arm's length, to measure every kindness against the weight of obligation and expectation. But this woman had asked for nothing, offered nothing but soup and shelter, and asked no questions he had not chosen to answer. It unsalved of more than the ropes had. They reached the cottage as the mist began to thin. It was a small place, 2 rooms, a thatched roof, smoke curling from the chimney, but it was neat and well-kept, with a small garden out front and a line of laundry fluttering in the breeze. A cat dozed on the windowsill, and a pair of chickens scratched in the dirt. The woman pushed open the door and gestured him inside. "Sit by the fire," she said. "I will heat the soup." He crossed the threshold, and the warmth of the hearth hit him like a wave. For a moment he stood there, swaying, overwhelmed by the simple smells of wood smoke and herbs and bread. It was a home. A real home with a woman's touch in every corner, dried flowers on the mantel, a child's drawing pinned to the wall, a worn but clean blanket draped over the chair. He had not been in a home like this in 30 years. "Sit," she said again, firmer this time, and he sat. Anne climbed onto the stool beside him, her legs too short to reach the floor, and watched him with those unblinking blue-gray eyes. "What is your name, anyway?" she asked. "You never said." He opened his mouth to give the lie again, the name he had prepared, the name of a dead merchant he had once known. But what came out instead, to his own surprise, was William. It was his true name, his oldest name, the one he had not spoken aloud to a stranger in decades. Anne beamed. "William," she repeated, testing it like a new flavor. "That is a good name. It sounds like a king's name." The man who was in fact a king felt the crack in his wall widen just a little more. "Perhaps it is," he said quietly. And as the widow ladled soup into a bowl and the child chattered on about dragons and lucky stones and the best ways to catch frogs, William of House Thornwood let himself, for the first time in 30 years, feel warm. The night did not pass quietly for William of House Thornwood. He lay on a narrow pallet near the hearth, a patched wool blanket drawn up to his chin, and listened to the sounds of a home he did not know. The fire crackled low. Somewhere in the rafters a mouse scratched. The wind pushed against the shutters with a sound like a held breath. His wrists ached where the ropes had bitten. His left shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat. But pain was an old companion, one he knew how to silence. What he could not silence was the noise in his head. The memory of the ambush, the taste of the wine that had been drugged, the faces of the men who had dragged him into the forest. He had been a fool, a king who trusted the wrong cup of wine, a king who had walked into a trap with his eyes open because he had been too proud to believe that anyone in his own court would dare. The child had found him at dawn. He remembered the way she had stared at him, her head tilted, her mouth a small circle of wonder. She had not screamed, she had not run. She had simply stood there in the mist, holding a fistful of wildflowers, and asked if he was a ghost. He had laughed. He could not remember the last time he had laughed. A floorboard creaked. William tensed, his hand moving instinctively to his belt. But there was no sword there, only the memory of one. He forced himself to breathe. The sound came again, softer this time, and then a small voice whispered through the darkness. "Are you awake?" It was the girl. Anne. William turned his head. The fire had burned down to embers, but he could still see her shape in the dim light. A small figure in a nightgown, clutching something to her chest. She padded closer, her bare feet silent on the packed earth floor, and stopped beside his pallet. "I brought you something," she whispered, "in case you could not sleep." She held out her hand. In her palm lay a stone, small and round and gray, with a white band running through it like a belt. "It is a lucky stone," she said seriously. "I have 3 more, but you can have this one. It is the second luckiest I own." William looked at the stone, then at the child. He had been a king for 30 years. He had received tribute and oaths and gifts of gold. No one had ever offered him a second luckiest stone. "Why the second luckiest?" he asked. Anne considered the question. "Because the first luckiest one saved me from a wasp last summer. It is very tired now. It needs to rest." He did not laugh this time. Something in his chest tightened instead, a muscle he had not used in so long that he barely recognized the feeling. "Thank you," he said quietly, and he took the stone. Anne beamed. She climbed onto the edge of his pallet without asking permission, tucking her feet beneath her like a bird settling into a nest. William shifted to make room, surprised at himself for doing so. "Do you have children?" she asked. The question hit him like a blow to the chest. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. For a moment, the only thing he could hear was the echo of a name he had not spoken in 30 years, a name that belonged to a girl with the same blue-gray eyes as the child sitting before him now. "No," he said finally, "I do not." "Oh." Anne nodded, accepting this without question. "That is all right. I did not have a father for a long time either, but Mama says that is not a sad thing. It is just a thing that is." William stared at her. In the dim light, her face was serious and old in the way that children's faces sometimes are, as if she had seen more than her 6 years should have allowed. "Your mother is wise," he said. "Mama is the wisest person in the whole world," Anne agreed. "She can make soup out of almost nothing, and she knows the names of all the stars, and she never cries, even when she thinks I am asleep." The last words caught his attention. "Does she cry often?" Anne shrugged, a small, quick movement. "Sometimes, but she does it quietly, so I pretend I do not hear. That way she does not have to feel bad about feeling bad." William said nothing. He had spent his life surrounded by courtiers who spoke in circles, who said one thing and meant another, who measured every word against its cost. This child had just explained the most delicate diplomacy he had ever witnessed, and she had done it without knowing she was doing anything at all. A new voice cut through the darkness. "Annabel Ashford, what are you doing out of bed?" The child flinched, a guilty look crossing her face. The widow stood in the doorway of the small bedchamber, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her hair loose and falling past her waist. In the firelight, her face was soft and tired, but not unkind. "I was just—" Anne began. "Back to bed," Maggie said gently. "The stranger needs his rest, and so do you." "His name is William," Anne said, sliding off the pallet. "And he is not a stranger anymore. He is our friend." She said it with such certainty that William felt the crack in his wall widen again. Maggie caught his eye over the child's head. There was a question there, and a warning, and something else he could not quite name. "Good night, William," Anne said, scurrying toward the door. She paused at the threshold. "I will leave the stone with you. It works better if you keep it under your pillow." Then she was gone, and the room felt suddenly larger and quieter. Maggie did not follow her immediately. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, studying him with those steady brown eyes. "She talks a great deal," she said. "I hope she did not keep you awake." "No," William said. "She is very good company." A ghost of a smile crossed Maggie's face. "She thinks so too." She hesitated, then stepped into the room, moving to the hearth to stir the embers back to life. "You should sleep while you can. Tomorrow we will see about getting you to the village healer." "That will not be necessary," William said. "I have had worse wounds." "I am sure you have." Maggie's voice was dry. "But you are in my house now, and I will not have a guest limping around with a shoulder the color of a bruise. You can argue with me in the morning." William opened his mouth to argue anyway, out of habit. But the words died in his throat. The fire had caught again, and in the new light he could see her hands, red and rough, the knuckles cracked, the fingers calloused in a way that spoke of years of hard work. He knew those hands. He had seen them on 100 women in his kingdom, women who rose before dawn and worked until dark and asked for nothing. "You are kind to take me in," he said. "I have nothing to repay you with." Maggie turned to fast think in him, a small pot of water in her hands. "I did not take you in to be repaid," she said simply. "You were hurt and alone, and my daughter found you. That is all." She knelt beside him and began to press a cool, damp cloth to his shoulder. The touch was so unexpected that William flinched. No one had touched him like this in years, not as a healer, not as a nurse. The last person who had tended to his wounds had been a surgeon who had sewn him up without a word and sent him back to battle. "This will help with the swelling," Maggie murmured, her voice low and matter-of-fact. "I have some willowbark tea left. It will taste terrible, but it will ease the pain." "I do not need—" "You do," she cut him off without raising her voice. "You are a proud man, I can tell, but pride will not mend a shoulder. Drink the tea and let your body rest for one night. You can be proud again in the morning." William looked at her. The firelight caught the lines around her eyes, the small fur of concentration between her brows. She was not beautiful in the way of the court ladies, with their painted faces and their silk gowns. She was beautiful in a different way, in the way of things that were real and solid and unbreakable. "Very well," he said, and he did not know which of them was more surprised. The tea was as terrible as she had promised. It tasted of earth and bitterness, and William drank it in silence while Maggie sat on a stool nearby, mending a torn shirt by firelight. She did not look at him. She did not try to fill the silence with talk. She simply sat there, her needle moving in steady arcs, and for the first time in 30 years, William found himself sharing a room with someone who did not want anything from him. He must have fallen asleep, because when he opened his eyes, again the fire had burned low, and the room was gray with early morning. The pallet beneath him was warm. The pain in his shoulder had dulled to a manageable ache. He lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the cottage coming to life. Somewhere in the other room a pot clattered. A child's voice rose in a song. Something about a crow and the thimble, nonsensical and cheerful. A woman's voice answered, warm and scolding at the same time. William of House Thornwood, Alpha King of Eldmoor, ruler of a kingdom that stretched from the sea to the mountains, closed his eyes and let himself pretend, just for a moment, that he was not a king at all, that he was just a man waking up in a warm house with people who did not know his name and did not care to. The door creaked open. Anne poked her head in, her hair a wild tangle of gold. "William," she said, delighted, "you are awake. Mamma said I must not wake you, but I told her you would want to see the newt I found in the garden. Do you want to see the newt?" William opened his eyes and looked at her. "I would like that very much," he said, and he meant it. The newt was, as it turned out, a creature of remarkable dignity. It sat on a flat stone in the middle of the garden path, blinking its small, golden eyes at the world with the air of a lord surveying his estate. Anne knelt before it, her chin resting on her fists, whispering something that sounded like an apology for having interrupted its mourning. William stood a few paces behind her, the borrowed cloak draped over his shoulders. The morning air had a bite to it, the kind that settled into a man's bones and reminded him that winter was not far off. His shoulder ached beneath the linen wrapping, but he had endured far worse. He had learned, long ago, to measure pain by what it cost him, and this was a debt he could pay. "Does he have a name?" William asked. Anne turned, her face bright with surprise. "I was just trying to decide. He looks like a Sir Basil, do you not think? Very serious, very important." "Sir Basil?" William repeated, tasting the name. "I knew a Sir Basil once. He was not serious at all. He once fell off his horse into a duck pond." Anne's laugh was a sudden bright thing, like a bell struck in a quiet room. "Did the ducks mind?" "I believe they were offended. He brought them bread for a week afterward to make amends." She considered this with the gravity of a 6-year-old who understood the weight of diplomatic relations. That was proper of him. Ducks hold grudges, you know. Marta says so. "Marta," William said, filing the name away. "Is she the one who makes the honey wine?" "Every autumn," Anne confirmed, nodding solemnly. "She calls it medicine, but I tasted it once and it was very silly tasting. It made my nose tingle. She said I must not tell anyone, and I have not, except for you, because you are not anyone." This was, William reflected, The most honest compliment he had received in 30 years. He was not anyone. He was, for the first time in his adult life, simply a man standing in a garden, discussing a newt with a 6-year-old child. The cottage door opened, and Maggie stepped out, a basket on her arm. She had changed into a clean dress, the same faded blue he had seen her wear the day before, and her hair was pinned back from her face. She looked at him for a long moment, as if measuring something, and then her gaze softened by a degree. "There is hot soup on the hearth," she said, "and bread. You should eat before it cools." "I am not," William began, and then stopped. He had been about to say he was not hungry, which was a lie. His stomach had been empty since before the ambush, and the smell drifting from the cottage was doing something complicated to his resolve. "Eat," Maggie said again, and there was no argument in her voice. It was the tone of a woman who had learned, through years of feeding a household, that hunger is not a matter for debate. William inclined his head. "Thank you." Anne had already scrabbled to her feet, abandoning Sir Basil to his morning meditations. "Mamma made the good soup," she said, tugging at William's sleeve, "with the barley and the little bits of turnip. She only makes the good soup when someone is sick or when it is a feast day. You must be very sick or very important." "Anne," Maggie said, her cheeks coloring slightly, "that is enough. But which is it, William? Are you sick or important?" William thought about the men who had bound him in the forest, the ones who had poured the bitter draught down his throat and left him for the crows. He thought about the weight of the crown he had worn for so long that its absence felt like a missing limb. "Neither," he said quietly. "I am just a man who is grateful for soup." Anne accepted this with the easy grace of a child who had not yet learned to distrust answers. She skipped ahead of them into the cottage, her voice rising again in the song about the crow and the thimble. Maggie fell into step beside him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The path was narrow, and their shoulders brushed once, briefly, before she shifted away. He felt the absence of that contact like a small, particular loss. "The soup is nothing special," she said, as if apologizing for it. "Just what I had in the larder. It is more than I had yesterday." She glanced at him, and there was something in her eyes that he and Van could not name, not pity. He had seen pity often enough to recognize it, and it always made his jaw tighten. This was something quieter, something that did not ask anything of him. "Then it is the least I can do," she said, and held the door open for him. The cottage was warm, filled with the soft light of the morning fire and the steam rising from a pot that hung over the flames. The table had been set with 3 bowls, 3 spoons, and a loaf of dark bread that someone, Maggie, he assumed, had baked before dawn. A small jar of wildflowers stood in the center of the table, the blooms still fresh with dew. William stopped in the doorway, struck by the simple abundance of it. The cottage was poor by any measure he knew. The walls were rough timber, the floor packed earth, the furniture worn and mended. But the table was laid as if for a feast, and the flowers had been picked with care, and there was something in the arrangement of it all that made his chest ache in a way he could not explain. "Sit," Maggie said, and he sat. The soup was thick and savory, the barley soft, the turnips sweet. William ate slowly, deliberately, the way he had learned to eat in the field when every mouthful had to last. Anne watched him with the intense focus of a small predator, her own bowl barely touched. "Do you like it?" she demanded. "It is the best soup I have had in years," he said honestly. Anne beamed. "Mama does not use the good salt for everyone, you know. She saved it for you." "Anne," Maggie said again, her voice carrying a warning that did not quite reach her eyes. "It is true. You did. I saw you. Take it down from the high shelf." "Marta is coming by this morning," Maggie said, cutting her daughter off with practiced ease. "She will want to see the state of your shoulder." William. Spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "Marta?" "The healer," Maggie said. "Or near enough. She has tended everyone in this village for 40 years, and she will not take no for an answer. Best to let her look at you now and get it over with." William had dealt with healers before. Palace physicians, battlefield surgeons, men who had prodded and poked at him with the same impersonal efficiency as a butcher assessing a carcass. He had learned to endure it with the same stoicism he endured everything else. "Very well," he said. Maggie nodded, and something in her posture relaxed. She had been braced for an argument, he realized. Braced for him to refuse, to demand to be left alone, to close himself off the way he had done with everyone else for 30 years. But he had not refused. He had not closed himself off. He had sat at her table and eaten her soup and let himself be directed like a man who belonged there. He was not sure when that had started to feel less like a surrender and more like a relief. The knock came an hour later, just as William had finished helping Anne stack the bowls by the wash basin. It was a brisk, businesslike knock, the kind that did not expect to be kept waiting. Maggie wiped her hands on her apron and crossed to the door. "That will be Marta. Mind your manners." "I always mind my manners," Anne protested, and then the door opened and the woman who stepped through it filled the room with her presence before she had said a single word. Old Marta was not tall, but she seemed to take up more space than the doorway allowed. Her hair was a wild mane of silver, pinned up with a collection of mismatched combs and pins, and her face was a map of wrinkles that spoke of decades of sun and wind and laughter. She carried a leather satchel in one hand and a think-it stick in the other, though she did not lean on it so much as wield it like a weapon. "Let me see him," she said, without preamble. "Maggie says you found him in the forest, tied up like a hog for market. Show me the ropes work." William rose from his seat, and Marta's sharp eyes traveled over him with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had seen every kind of wound and most kinds of lies. "Big fellow," she said, not impressed. "That shoulder. Then take off the cloak and the shirt." William hesitated. The shirt was Maggie's husband's, a worn linen thing that fit him poorly across the shoulders. Beneath it, the wrappings hid the bruise that spread across his left shoulder like a stain of wine. "Do it," Marta said, and there was no room for argument in her voice. "I have seen more men than you have seen battles, and I have not fainted yet." William unfastened the cloak and pulled the shirt over his head, turning his back to the fire so the light fell across the wound. Marta clicked her tongue and moved forward, her fingers prodding at the edges of the bruise with a gentleness that surprised him. "Poison," she said, after a moment. "Or near enough. Someone gave you something to make you sleep. The bruise is from the fall when it took hold. You are lucky it was a soft patch of moss and not a rock." William said nothing. He did not want to think about the men who had done this to him, or the reason they had done it, or the fact that one of his own household must have betrayed him. He did not want to think about any of it. Marta's fingers paused at the edge of the scar that ran from his brow to his cheekbone. She studied it for a long moment, and something flickered in her eyes that might have been recognition. "That is an old wound," she said quietly. "From a blade, and not a clean one. You have carried that for a long time." "As long as I have carried everything else," William said. Marta grunted. "Sit down before you fall down. I will make a poultice for the shoulder, and you will drink another cup of the willow bark tea. It will taste foul, but it will do the work." She busied herself with her satchel, pulling out jars and cloths and small bundles of dried herbs. Anne had crept closer, watching with wide eyes as Marta worked. "Marta," Anne said, "William says he knew a Sir Basil who fell into a duck pond." Marta's hands did not pause. "I knew a Sir Basil once. He was a pompous ass who thought his horse was the finest in the kingdom. He deserved the duck pond." "Mamma says I must not say ass," Anne reported, with the air of one delivering important intelligence. "And you must not, until you are old enough to use it properly," Marta said. "Now hush and let me work." She applied the poultice with a firm hand, and William gritted his teeth against the sting of it. The cold herb mixture seeped into his skin, drawing out the heat of the bruise. When she was done, she bound it fresh, and stepped back to survey her work. "There," she said, satisfied. "You will live, though you will ache for a few days more. Do not lift anything heavy, and do not be a fool about it." "I will try," William said. Marta snorted. "Men always say that, and then they go and do the foolish thing anyway. Mark my words, you will be lifting something heavy within the week." She packed her satchel with the same brisk efficiency, and then she paused, looking at William with a curious expression. "I heard something in the village this morning," she said. "Talk of a commotion up at the castle. Some great lord has gone missing, they say. The soldiers are turning over every dome between here and the river. William's blood went cold. He kept his face still, the way he had learned to keep it still in 12 courts and 100 battlefields. "Is that so?" he said, his voice flat. Marta nodded. "They say it is someone important, someone the king would miss." She looked at him again, and her eyes were sharp as flint. "You would not know anything about that, would you?" The question hung in the air. William could feel Maggie's gaze on him and Anne's and Marta's. He could feel the weight of the lie forming in his mouth, the practiced words that had gotten him through 1,000 diplomatic encounters. "William was in the forest," Anne said, before he could answer. "He was tied up like the hog at market. Marta said so herself." The tension broke. Marta laughed, a rusty sound like a wheel turning after a long winter. "Aye, that I did. And a hog he is, with a poultice on his shoulder and a fool's look on his face." William let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. The moment had passed, but it had left a tremor behind. He had come within a hair's breadth of being discovered, and he knew with sudden, certain clarity that he was not ready. Not because he feared the soldiers who would come for him. He had faced worse than soldiers, but because he was not ready to leave this cottage, not ready to leave the warm fire and the wildflowers on the table and the sound of a child's laughter ringing through the morning. He was not ready to go back to being the man who had been tied up in the forest, waiting for the crows. Maggie had turned away, busying herself with the kettle. When she spoke, her voice was light, but William caught the edge beneath it. "There is always talk at the castle. It means nothing to us here." Marta hummed, non-committal. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it means something, and we will find out soon enough." She hoisted her satchel onto her shoulder and fixed William with a final piercing look. "You take care of that shoulder, and you take care of these two. They have good hearts, both of them, rarer than gold." "I know," William said, and he was surprised by how much he meant it. Marta left as briskly as she had come, and the cottage seemed to exhale. Maggie set 3 fresh cups of tea on the table, and Anne climbed onto the bench beside William, her small hand brushing his sleeve. "Marta is not so scary," Anne said. "She just talks loud." "She is very loud," William agreed. "She likes you," Anne said, with the certainty of a child who had not yet learned to doubt her own perceptions. "She would not have fixed your shoulder if she did not." Maggie sat down across from them, wrapping her hands around her cup of tea. She did not look at him directly, but he could feel her attention like a warm weight on his skin. "The soup," she said, "is still hot, if you want more." "Thank you," William said. "I would like that." And for the first time in 30 years, sitting in a poor cottage at a table with a dead man's cloak around his shoulders and a child's hand on his sleeve, William of House Thornwood allowed himself to want more. He wanted more of this, more of the warm fire and the good soup and the woman who did not ask him any questions he could not answer. He wanted to stay. And that, he knew, was the most dangerous thing he had wanted in a very long time. The 3rd morning brought a sound that William had been dreading since the moment he had opened his eyes in this cottage. Horses, many of them, their hooves thudding against the frozen earth of the village lane, their harnesses jingling with the unmistakable precision of a royal escort. William sat up slowly, his shoulder protesting the sudden movement. Through the small window he could see the pale gray light of dawn, and beyond it the dark shapes of riders moving through the mist. There were at least 12 of them, perhaps more, and they were not moving like men who were simply passing through. They were searching. Maggie appeared in the doorway of the sleeping alcove, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes wide with alarm. She was wearing a thin shawl over her nightdress, and her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles white. "They are looking for someone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They stopped at old Marta's first. I heard them from the garden." William did not answer. He was already reaching for the cloak, his fingers finding the rough wool of the dead man's garment that had become his only shield. His wrist still ached where the ropes had bitten, but the pain was a familiar companion now, and he knew how to wear it. "I must go," he said, and the words felt like a betrayal. Maggie took a step closer. "Go where? The forest is full of soldiers. The river road is watched. If you go now, you will be caught within the hour." Then I will be caught. And then what? Her voice was sharp now, the sharpness of a woman who had buried a husband and would not easily bury another. What do you think they will do to a stranger found hiding in a widow's cottage, wearing her dead husband's cloak? William met her eyes. He had faced armies, had stood before charging cavalry without flinching, had watched men die at his command and carried the weight of it silently. But this woman's gaze, steady and unafraid, was something else entirely. I am not a stranger, he said quietly, that I into problem. Before Maggie could answer, Anne burst through the door, her small face flushed with cold and excitement. She was wearing her patched woolen dress and carrying a stone in each hand, her pockets bulging with the morning's treasures. "Mama! There are soldiers! Real soldiers with swords and horses and—" She stopped, her blue-gray eyes landing on William. "Are they looking for you?" The question hung in the air like winter frost. William did not know how to answer. He had never been good with children, had never needed to be, had spent 30 years avoiding the very sight of small faces that reminded him of everything he had lost. But this child, this impossible child with her stones and her dandelion crowns and her absolute faith, had somehow slipped past every wall he had built. "No," he said finally. "They are looking for someone else." Anne tilted her head, considering this. Then she nodded, as if the matter were settled, and unnawed one of the stones in her hand. "This one is for you. I found it by the river. It looks like a heart, see? It will keep you safe." William looked down at the stone in her small palm. It was gray and smooth, worn by years of water, and it did indeed have a shape that resembled a heart, imperfect and lopsided but unmistakable. "Thank you," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. He took the stone. It was warm from her hand. The knock at the door came before any of them could move. It was not the heavy, commanding knock of a soldier. It was a single, sharp rap, the kind of knock that came from someone who was used to being obeyed without question. Maggie looked at William, then at Anne. "Both of you, stay here. Do not make a sound." She crossed the room and opened the door a crack, blocking the view of the cottage, interior wit, game her body. The man outside was tall and gray-haired, his face lined with years of service and worry. He wore the dark green and silver of the Royal Guard, and his hand rested on the hilt of his sword with the casual ease of a man who had drawn it many times. "Good woman," the man said, his voice formal but weary. "I am searching for a man who has gone missing from the capital, a man of importance. He would be injured, possibly disoriented. Have you seen any strangers in these parts?" Maggie's voice was steady. "We have had no strangers here, sir, only the usual travelers, and none of them stayed." The man's eyes narrowed. "You are certain?" "I am certain." For a long moment the man said nothing, then he glanced past Maggie, into the dimness of the cottage, and William saw his eyes catch on something. He could not see what it was, but he felt the weight of that gaze like a physical blow. "Forgive me," the man said, and his voice had changed, softer now, almost wondering. "Your daughter, she has blue-gray eyes, does she not?" Maggie stiffened. "She has her father's eyes." "Yes," the man said slowly. "I imagine she does." And then, before Maggie could stop him, the man pushed the door open and stepped inside. William rose to his feet, the cloak falling away from his shoulders, and met the man's gaze. Sir Cedric's face went pale. "Your Majesty," he breathed, and dropped to one knee. The word fell into the small cottage like a stone into still water. Maggie turned to look at William, her face unreadable. Anne looked from the kneeling soldier to William, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Majesty," Anne repeated. "What does that mean?" William did not answer her. He was looking at Sir Cedric, at the man who had served him faithfully for 20 years, who had been the only one trusted with his life. "Rise," he said quietly. "There is no need for that here." Cedric rose, his eyes moving rapidly over William's face, cataloguing the bruises and the pallor, the lines of pain that William had not been able to hide. "Your Majesty, we have been searching for you for 3 days. The court is in chaos. There are rumors that you have been killed, that you have fled, that—" "The rumors are wrong," William said. "I was ambushed. 4 men, hired for the purpose. They left me for dead in the forest." Cedric's jaw tightened. "I will find them. They were paid to do a job. The ones who paid them are the ones I want." William paused. But not here, not now. He looked at Maggie, who had not moved from her place by the door. Her face was very still, and he could not tell what she was thinking. "You knew," she said, and it was not a question. "I could not tell you. No, I suppose you could not." She looked at the cloak, still lying on the floor where he had dropped it. "My husband's cloak. You wore my husband's cloak, and you did not tell me who you were." "I am sorry." Maggie said nothing. She walked to the table and picked up the pot of soup that had been simmering over the fire. The soup she had made with the good salt, the soup she had made for a stranger she had chosen to trust. She poured a bowl, set it on the table, and pushed it toward him. "You will need your strength," she said. "Eat before you go." William stared at the bowl. Then he looked at her, at this woman who had taken him in, who had dressed his wounds, who had lied to a royal guard to protect him, and who now, knowing who he was, had given him soup. "Margaret," he said, and her name felt strange on his tongue, a name he had only heard her use once before, when she had thought he was asleep. "I have cult 6%. He looked up. "I am the King of Eldmoor," he said. "I have the power to give you anything. Lands, gold, a position at court, name it, and it is yours." Maggie was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Are your wounds healed?" "What?" "Your wounds. Your shoulder, your wrist, the poison that was in your blood, are they healed?" William blinked. "They are better." "Then that is all I want," she said simply. "That is all I have ever wanted." Anne, who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes, tugged at William's sleeve. "Are you really the king?" she asked. William looked down at her, at this small child with her heart-shaped stone, and her dandelion crowns, and her absolute faith in the goodness of strangers. "Yes," he said, "I am." Anne considered this for a moment. Then she smiled, a wide, gap-toothed smile that lit up her entire face. "Do you want my stone? It's lucky. I gave it to you already, so it's yours now. Kings need luck, too." William felt something crack inside his chest, something that had been frozen for 30 years. He knelt down, bringing himself to her level, and placed the stone carefully in his pocket. "I will keep it always," he said, "and I will think of you when I look at it." Women and her child had walked their quiet lives. He did not want to leave, but he was the king, and the king did not have the luxury of staying. "Margaret," he said, "I will send word. You will be taken care of, both of you. You will not want for anything." "We have never wanted for much," Maggie said quietly. "We have always had enough." William nodded. He did not know what else to say. He wanted to thank her, to explain what her kindness had meant to him. But the words would not come. He reached into his pocket and touched the heart-shaped stone. "Goodbye," he said. Anne ran to him and wrapped her arms around his legs, pressing her face against his hip. "Come back," she said, her voice muffled. "Promise you'll come back." William knelt down and gently pried her loose, holding her at arm's length so he could look into her eyes. "I promise," he said, and he meant it. He walked out of the cottage into the cold morning air, Sir Cedric at his side. The soldiers had gathered in the lane, their horses stamping and snorting in the frost. As he mounted the horse that Cedric had brought, William looked back at the cottage. Maggie was standing in the doorway, Anne's hand in hers, the firelight warm behind them. He raised his hand in farewell, and Maggie raised hers in answer. Then he turned his horse toward the capital and rode away from the only warmth he had known in 30 years. The capital was a different world from the cottage by the river. William felt it the moment he rode through the gates of Ravenhall Castle, the cold stone walls rising around him like the bars of a cage he had built for himself long ago. The courtyard was a blur of activity. Stable boys rushed to take his horse, servants bowed low, and Sir Cedric moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his life in the king's shadow. But William barely saw any of it. His hand kept drifting to the pocket of his tunic, where the small heart-shaped stone sat warm against his chest. He had not taken it out since leaving the village. He was not sure why he kept it. His private chambers were exactly as he had left them, cold and orderly, every object in its proper place. A fire had been lit in the hearth, and the flames cast long shadows across the stone floor. William stood before the window and watched the sun sink below the walls of the city, and for the first time in 30 years, the silence of the room felt too loud. He had been alone in this room for 3 decades. He had never noticed the emptiness before. The next morning, William summoned his council. The great hall filled with the lords and advisers who had spent the past 3 days whispering about his disappearance. They bowed as he entered, but their eyes were hungry for answers, for weakness, for any sign that the Alpha King was not as invincible as he appeared. William seated himself on the throne and regarded them in silence for a long moment. "I was ambushed," he said at last. His voice carried across the hall, flat and unyielding. 4 men, hired by someone who wished me dead. The men are dead now, killed in the forest. The one who hired them remains unknown. A murmur rippled through the hall. Lord Dryden, a thin man with a pointed beard and eyes that never quite met anyone's gaze, stepped forward with a look of studied concern. "Your Grace, this is grave news," Dryden said, his voice oil-smooth. "We feared the worst. The kingdom has been uneasy in your absence." "The kingdom will survive," William said. "I did." He dismissed the council with a curt nod, but his eyes lingered on Dryden, more of a minute longer than was comfortable. The man's concern felt practiced, his bow just a fraction too deep. William filed the observation away in the part of his mind that had kept him alive through 30 years of courtly intrigue. Back in his chambers, he found Sir Cedric waiting for him. "The men who attacked you," Cedric said without preamble, "I have their names. They were sellswords from the northern border, men with no loyalty to any house." "And their employer? Dead ends," Cedric admitted. "Whoever hired them was careful. The coin used to pay them was untraceable." William nodded slowly. He had expected as much. A man did not rise to the position of Alpha King without making enemies, and those enemies were rarely careless. "There's another matter," Cedric said, his tone shifting slightly. "The village. The woman and her child. If the ones who hired those men learn that they sheltered you, they may become targets." William's jaw tightened. He had thought of this, of course. It had kept him awake through the long ride back to the capital, the image of Anne's small face and Maggie's steady eyes burning in his mind. "I will not allow it," he said quietly. "Your Grace?" William turned from the window. "I will invite them to the capital. As guests of the crown, they will be protected within these walls until the threat is resolved." Cedric's eyebrows rose slightly, but he said nothing. It was not his place to question the king's decisions, however unusual they might be. William sat down at his desk and took out a sheet of parchment. The words came slowly, more carefully than any royal decree he had ever written. He was not accustomed to this kind of letter, the kind that asked rather than commanded. When it was finished, he handed it to Cedric. "Deliver this yours, ye think?" he said. "Do not entrust it to anyone else." Cedric bowed. "By your command." 3 days later, Cedric rode into the village of Ashford and pulled his horse to a stop before the small cottage by the river. Maggie was in the yard, hanging laundry on a line that sagged between 2 birch trees. She looked up when she heard the horse, and her hand went still on the wet cloth she was holding. "Good morning, mistress," Cedric said, dismounting. "I bring a message from the king." Maggie's face was unreadable. "From the king?" "He requests the honor of your presence, and your daughter's, at Ravenhall Castle. He wishes to thank you properly for the care you gave him." The letter was in his hand, creased and folded, sealed with the royal insignia of House Thornwood. Maggie stared at it for a long moment. "I am only a washerwoman," she said quietly. "I do not know the ways of court." "The king does not ask for courtly manners," Cedric replied, and there was something almost gentle in his voice. "He asks only that you come." Anne appeared in the doorway of the cottage, curiosity bright in her blue-gray eyes. "Is the king coming back?" she asked. Cedric looked down at her, and for a moment a flicker of something crossed his stern face. "No, child. He asks that you come to him." Anne's face lit up. "Can we, Mama? Can we?" Maggie looked at the letter in her hands, then at her daughter's eager face. The washerwoman in her wanted to refuse, to stay safe in the small world she had built for herself and Anne. But the mother in her saw the joy in her child's eyes, and the woman in her remembered the way the king had looked at her before he rode away, as if she had given him something he did not know how to name. "We will come," she said. The journey to the capital took the better part of a day. Cedric provided a horse and a cart, and Anne spent most of the ride with her face pressed against the side of the cart, watching the landscape change from familiar fields to the high stone walls of Ravenhall Castle. The castle was overwhelming. Maggie had seen it from a distance before, a dark shape on the horizon, but she had never dreamed of standing inside its walls. The servants who greeted them were polite but distant, and they were led through corridors hung with tapestries and lined with suits of armor, past windows that looked out over the sprawling city below. William was waiting for them in the great hall. He stood in his formal robes, his gray-blue eyes fixed on the door as they entered, and for a moment no one spoke. Then Anne broke free of her mother's hand and ran across the stone floor, her small boots clicking against the tiles. "Your Grace," she called, using the title she had heard Cedric use, though it came out garbled and slightly too loud. "You came back! I knew you would!" William's face remained still, but something in his eyes softened. He knelt down with a grace that surprised Maggie, bringing himself to the child's level. "I told you I would," he said. Anne beamed at him. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a handful of yellow flowers, slightly crushed but still bright. "I picked these for you," she said, thrusting them at him. "Dandelions are the best flowers. They're not fancy, but they're strong. They grow anywhere." William took the flowers carefully, as if they were made of glass. "Thank you," he said. Anne was not finished. She reached up and, with the unself-conscious confidence of a child who had never been taught to fear a king, placed the crushed dandelions on top of his head like a crown. "There," she said, stepping up to admire her work. "Now you're a flower king instead of a stone king." The words hung in the air. William's hands trembled slightly, and his jaw worked as if he were trying to speak. Then, without warning, a tear slipped down his cheek and disappeared into his beard. Maggie's breath caught. She watched as the king, the most powerful man in Eldmoor, stood very still with dandelions in his hair and tears running silently down his face. And in that moment she did not see a king at all. She saw a man who had been alone for a very long time. She stepped forward and reached out, her fingers brushing against the scar that ran from his brow to his cheekbone. "Who hurt you?" she asked softly. William flinched, but he did not pull away. His eyes met hers, and for a moment she thought he might answer. Then he looked down at Anne, who was watching him with solemn concern, and the moment passed. "It was a long time ago," he said. He did not say anything else, but as he stood there, dandelion petals falling from his hair, William felt something crack open in his chest, something he had kept locked shut for 30 years. He did not know what it was or what it meant. He only knew that for the first time in a very long time, he did not want to be alone. The morning after the dandelion crown, William woke to a knock that carried too much weight. Sir Cedric entered before the king could answer, his face set in the particular stillness that meant bad news. He closed the heavy oak door behind him and stood with his hands clasped, as if bracing himself. "Your Majesty," Cedric said, "there is talk in the city." William sat up, the wool blanket falling to his waist. He had slept poorly, though not from any ache in his wounds, which had healed well enough. It was the warmth of the perfect thinking there, like it's out so really in the street. Coming into his thisky fingers placing dandelions in his hair, the brush of a woman's fingers against his scar. "What talk?" he asked, his voice flat. "Lord Dryden has been busy." Cedric chose the word carefully. "He has spent the past 3 evenings hosting small gatherings of minor lords at his townhouse. Wine, honey cakes, and whispers about the king's judgment." William's jaw tightened. "My judgment." "He speaks of the attack in the Thornwood, not as an act of treason against the crown, but as proof that the king has grown careless. That you rode with too few guards into territory too close to the border without proper counsel." Cedric paused. "He frames it as concern, Your Majesty, the concern of a loyal subject who fears for his sovereign's safety." "Loyal?" William repeated the word as if tasting something sour. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and reached for his tunic. And what does Dryden propose this loyal subject do about his sovereign's carelessness? He proposes a council of regency to advise you on matters of security and state. He has suggested that you are burdened, Your Majesty, that the weight of the crown has become too heavy for one man to bear alone. William stood, and for a moment the morning light caught the scar that ran from his brow to his cheekbone, making it gleam like a pale river against his skin. "A council of regency," he said slowly. "That is a gentle name for a cage." "It is, Your Majesty. He wants me to step aside, to let him and his allies rule in my name while I sit in the corner like a tamed dog." Cedric said nothing, which was answer enough. William moved to the window and looked out over the city. The morning fog was burning off, revealing the crowded rooftop.
Think Ravenhall, the smoke of 1,000 hearths rising into the pale sky. Somewhere down there, in the kitchens or the gardens or the long stone corridors, a little girl with golden curls was probably asking someone where the king had gone. He closed his eyes briefly. "What else?" he asked quietly. "There is more, isn't there?" Cedric hesitated. This hesitation was unlike him, and William turned to face his old friend, reading the discomfort in the knight's stiff shoulders. "There are rumors," Cedric said at last, "about the maid." William's blood went cold. "What rumors?" "That she is not what she seems. That her discovery of you in the Thornwood was too convenient. That she may have been placed there by enemies of the crown to win your trust and gain access to the palace." The words were still hanging in the air when William crossed the room in 3 long strides, his hand closing around the front of Cedric's tunic. It was an undignified gesture, unworthy of a king, and he knew it. But for a moment, he was not a king. He was a man who had just been told that the only warmth he had felt in 30 years was being dragged through the mud. "She is a laundress," William said, his voice low and dangerous. "A widow who mends shirts and sings old songs to her daughter. She found me tied to a tree and she did not run. She fed me soup and asked nothing in return. She is not a spy." "I know this, Your Majesty." "Then why are you telling me this?" Cedric did not flinch under the king's grip. He had known William for 20 years, had bled beside him in a dozen battles, had watched him bury a wife and a daughter, and then build walls of stone around his heart. He was not afraid of the man's temper. "Because I know it, and you know it, but the court does not," Cedric said steadily. "Think Long Dryden is not the only one whispering. There are others who profit from your discomfort. The rumors have already reached the kitchens, the stables, the guard barracks. By tonight they will reach every tavern in Ravenhall." William released him and stepped back, his chest heaving. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough texture of the scar under his palm. "Dryden," he said, "he is behind this." "I cannot prove it, Your Majesty. You do not need to prove it. I know it the way I know my own hand." William turned back to the window, his shoulders heavy. "He cannot touch me directly, so he will try to isolate me, remove the people I trust, surround me with his own voices until I no longer know which way is true. That is what I believe he intends. And the maid and her daughter, they are the easiest target. A poor widow and her child, no allies, no protection, no one to speak for them. If he can paint her as a spy, he can have her arrested, questioned, perhaps worse." Cedric's silence confirmed the fear. William stood at the window for a long moment, watching the fog lift over the city. In the garden below, a servant was sweeping the gravel path, and for a fleeting second, William imagined he saw a flash of golden curls among the rose bushes. But it was only a trick of the light. "Send them home," he said quietly. "Your Majesty? The maid and her daughter? Have them escorted back to Ashford village today, with a small purse of silver as thanks for their service to the crown. Make it a formal matter, official, so that no one can say they were favored or hidden. Your Majesty, the girl—" "Send them home, Cedric." William's voice cracked just slightly on the last word. "It is not safe for them here,
and if I keep them close, I will only feed Dryden's lies.
Think. The king has been bewitched by a common woman. He will use them to destroy us all. Cedric bowed, but his eyes were troubled. By your command. When the night had gone, William remained at the window for a long time. He had given the order. It was the right order, the only order that would keep them safe. But for the first time in 30 years, doing the right thing felt like a knife turning in his chest. Maggie was in the small guest chamber that had been assigned to her, folding Anne's spare dress when the knock came. She had known the visit could not last forever. Kings did not keep laundresses in their palaces. But the 2 days of warmth, of good food and soft beds, of watching Anne laugh and run through the gardens, it had felt like a dream, and she had known, even as she lived it, that dreams must end. Sir Cedric stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. Behind him, a young guard waited with a folded bundle of cloth and a small leather purse. "Lord Ashford," Cedric said, and then corrected himself. "Mistress Ashford. The king has asked that you be escorted back to your village today." Maggie's hands stilled on the dress. "Today?" "Yes. Provisions have been arranged for your journey. The king wishes to express his gratitude for your service to the crown." Cedric held out the purse, a small token of his appreciation. She took it, but her fingers barely closed around the leather. "May I?" She stopped. "May I thank him? Before we go?" Cedric's expression flickered, just for a moment. "The king is occupied with matters of state," he said. "He asked that I convey his regards." Regards, a small purse of silver, a formal escort home. Maggie looked down at the purse in her hand, and she understood. Whatever warmth had passed between them in the garden, whatever unspoken thing had crackled in the air when her fingers brushed his scar. It was over now. He was a king. She was a laundress. The dream was over. "Of course," she said, and her voice was steady, which surprised her. "Please thank His Majesty for his kindness." Anne was in the garden collecting pebbles near the fountain when her mother came to fetch her. The little girl looked up with a face full of sunshine, her pockets bulging with stones. "Mama, look, this one is shaped like a heart. I'm going to give it to the king." Maggie knelt down and smoothed her daughter's hair. "The king is busy today, love. We're going home." Anne's face fell. "Home? But I wanted to show him my stones." "He liked the dandelions, Mama." He smiled. "He did smile, love. But kings have much work to do, and we have our own home to tend to, don't we? The chickens need feeding, and Marta will be worried about us." Anne considered this. Her small brow furrowed, then she nodded, with the solemn gravity only a 6-year-old can manage. "Okay, Mama, but I'm keeping the heartstone for him. For later." Maggie hugged her daughter tightly, pressing her face into the golden curls, and did not let herself cry. The journey back to Ashford village took most of the day. The guard escorted them in a simple cart with a basket of bread and cheese and a skin of watered wine. Anne fell asleep against her mother's shoulder halfway through, her small hands still clutching the heart-shaped stone. Maggie watched the fields pass by, the golden stubble of harvested wheat, the distant smoke of farmhouse chimneys. She had known, from the moment she found the bound man in the Thornwood, that this could not end simply. A king did not walk out of a laundress's life without leaving marks, but she had not expected it to end so abruptly. So, formally, she thought of the way he had looked at her in the garden, dandelion petals in his hair, tears on his cheeks. She thought of the roughness of his scar under her fingertips, the way he had flinched and then not pulled away. She thought of the word he had almost said, the thing he had almost told her, before Anne's presence had closed the door. There was a man inside the king, a man who was hurting, who had been hurting for a very long time, and she had seen him, just for a moment before the walls went back up. As the cart rattled into Ashford village, past the familiar cottages and the smell of wood smoke, Maggie pressed the purse of silver into her apron pocket and made a decision. She would not forget him. She would not pretend the garden had not happened. But she would also not chase a king who had chosen to send her away. She had a daughter to raise, a home to tend, and a life to live. Whatever William of House Thornwood was carrying, it was not hers to carry with him. But as she lifted the sleeping Anne from the cart and carried her across the threshold of their small cottage,
Maggie could not help the small, stubborn hope that flickered in her chest. He had let her touch his scar. He had let her see him weep. Whatever he was running from, she thought, he was not running fast enough to escape that. The days that followed were quiet. William threw himself into the work of ruling, burying himself in petitions and ledgers and council meetings until his eyes burned and his back ached. He did not visit the garden. He did not ask after the maid or her daughter. He did not allow himself to think about a small voice asking, "Do you want my stone? It's lucky." Lord Dryden made his move 3 weeks after the maid and her daughter returned to their village.
It came in the form of a formal petition, presented to the court with all the ceremony of a loyal subject's concern. The king, Dryden argued, had been the victim of a near-fatal attack. The king had shown remarkable mercy to the woman who found him, a woman of unknown background and questionable connections. The king had perhaps been too trusting, too soft. "Your Majesty," Dryden said, his voice dripping with honey, "it is the duty of those who love their sovereign to speak plainly. The realm is concerned. Your enemies are watching, and there are those who wonder whether the crown has grown too heavy for a single pair of hands." William sat on the throne, his face carved from stone, and listened. He listened to Dryden's careful words, to the murmur of agreement from the minor lords, to the silence of those who were too afraid to speak against the tide. He listened, and he felt the trap closing around him, a council of regency, a small committee of trusted lords who would advise the king, oversee his security, ensure the smooth running of the realm. It sounded reasonable. It sounded wise. It was a cage. "If the king is unable to manage his own safety," Dryden concluded, "then the realm must take steps to protect itself. This is not a challenge to your authority, Your Majesty. It is a shield for it." William's hands gripped the arms of the throne. He could refuse, of course. He could dismiss the petition, send Dryden away, assert his authority with the full weight of the crown. But to do so would be to play into the man's hands, to prove that he was indeed too prideful to accept wise counsel, too stubborn to see his own weakness. And beneath all of that, the whisper of his own old guilt. He had been careless. He had ridden into the Thornwood with too few guards. The 6-year-old girl had found him tied to a tree. If she had been a knife instead of a child, he would be dead. Perhaps Dryden was right. Perhaps he was no longer fit to rule alone. "We will consider this petition," William said at last, his voice flat and distant. "The court is dismissed." When the hall emptied, he remained on the throne, staring at the cold stone floor. Sir Cedric approached and stood at the foot of the dais, his face grim. "Your Majesty cannot accept this. A council of regency would strip you of your power within a year." "I know," William said. "Then why did you not refuse?" William looked up, and for a moment the mask slipped. Beneath the king's cold eyes was something raw and tired, a man who had been fighting alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to have anyone at his back. "Because I am tired, Cedric," he said quietly, "and because I cannot protect even a widow and her child from the poison in my own court. What use is a king who cannot protect anyone?" Cedric opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. There were no words for this. There never had been. In the silence that followed, a servant entered with a folded piece of parchment on a silver tray. It was a small thing, unremarkable, sealed with plain wax. William took it and broke the seal. Inside was a single line, written in a neat, careful hand that he recognized instantly. "I hope your soup is still hot and your nights are not too cold. M." There was no request, no plea, no reminder of what had passed between them in the garden. Just a small, quiet kindness sent from a village a day's ride away. William stared at the letter for a long time. Then he folded it carefully, slid it into his tunic, and said nothing. Cedric watched his king's face and saw something shift there. Something that looked almost like hope, but it was quickly buried, hidden beneath the same old stone. And by the time William spoke again, his voice was once again the voice of a king. "Send word to Lord Dryden that I will meet with his council. Tomorrow morning we have a realm to govern." And in the pocket of his tunic, pressed against his heart, the small letter waited in silence.
The harvest festival came to Ashford Village on the last day of autumn, when the fields had been stripped bare and the air carried the first true bite of winter. Every cottage door was hung with dried flowers and braided wheat, and the smell of roasting apples drifted from the square from dawn until dusk. Maggie had spent the morning helping old Marta set up her stall of honey mead and spiced bread. The old woman fussed over the arrangement of her jars, moving one to the left, then back to the right, muttering under her breath the whole while. "Mark my words," Marta said, straightening her back with a groan. "This will be the best harvest festival in 10 years. I can feel it in my knees." Maggie laughed softly and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "You say that every year, Marta. And every year I am right." Anne came running through the crowd, her cheeks flushed pink with excitement, a garland of dried leaves already slipping sideways off her head. She grabbed her mother's hand and tugged. "Mama, they have a goat race. Can I watch? Can I stay for the whole thing?" "Yes, love. But stay where I can see you." Anne nodded vigorously and was gone again, disappearing between the skirts and cloaks of the villagers like a small golden fish in a crowded stream. The festival was a good thing, Maggie reminded herself. It gave the village a reason to smile before the long,
sack bat out my months of winter, and it gave her a reason to stop thinking about other things like a tall man with gray-blue eyes and a scar across his face, and the letter she had sent 3 weeks ago that had never received an answer. She pressed her lips together and began arranging Marta's jars in neat rows, the way the old woman liked them. High on the ridge that overlooked the valley, a man sat astride a dark horse, cloaked in gray, his hood pulled low against the wind. He had been there since dawn, watching the village below with an attention that had nothing to do with the festival. Sir Cedric shifted in his saddle beside him. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "you have been here for 3 hours. The patrol has found nothing. There is no sign of Dryden's men in the area." William did not look at him. His eyes remained fixed on the tiny moving figures in the square below, on a woman in a faded blue dress and a small girl with hair the color of ripe wheat. "I am here to inspect the harvest," he said flatly. "It is a matter of record." "It is a matter of record," Cedric agreed, "that your Grace has inspected this village every day for the past 3 weeks. The court is beginning to notice." Let them notice, William thought. Let them talk. The vultures in the capital could circle all they wished. They would find nothing here but a king checking on the welfare of his people. That was the story, and he would stick to it until the lie became the truth. But his eyes betrayed him. They kept finding a woman in the blue dress, kept following the small, golden-haired child as she darted through the crowd, and something in his chest ached with a pain he had not allowed himself to feel in 30 years. He had told himself it was for their safety. He had told himself that staying away was the only way to protect them from the poison spreading through the court. But watching them from a distance was its own kind of poison, and it seeped into his bones a little more with each passing day. Below, the goat race began, and the sound of laughter and cheering rose up the hillside like birdsong. Anne was at the front of the crowd, jumping up and down, her voice carrying even over the noise. "Go, little goat, go!" A man beside her, a farmer by the look of his boots, laughed and said something to her. Anne answered him with a bright, unguarded smile. William's grip on the reins tightened. "You are frowning, Your Grace," Cedric observed. "I am not frowning. I am inspecting the harvest." "The harvest is in the fields behind the village, Your Grace. You are looking at the festival." William fell silent, and Cedric, wise man that he was, said nothing more. The afternoon wore on. The sun sank lower in the pale autumn sky, and the shadows grew long across the valley. Maggie had lost sight of Anne twice, and had retrieved her both times from the edge of the cider tent, where the girl had been trying to coax the brewer's dog into chasing her. "She is a handful, that one," Marta said, watching Anne chase the dog in circles. "Reminds me of myself at her age." "God help us all," Maggie murmured, and Marta cackled with delight. It was then that Anne stopped mid-step, her head turning toward the ridge above the village. Her gaze lifted, searching, as if she had felt something. Maggie followed her daughter's gaze. The ridge was empty, just gray grass and bare trees, and the deepening blue of the early evening sky. "What is it, love?" Anne tilted her head, squinting. "I thought I saw someone." "There is no one there, sweetheart, just the trees."
Anne frowned, unconvinced. Then she shrugged. Her attention caught by the dog again, and she was off, running and laughing, the garland on her head finally falling off into the dirt. Maggie bent to pick it up, and for a moment she stood still, looking at the ridge. She had felt it too, she realized. A prickling at the back of her neck, like being watched by a familiar presence. She had felt it every day for the past 3 weeks, whenever she walked to the river to wash, or hung the laundry in the yard, or sat on the doorstep shelling peas in the evening light. She had told herself it was nothing, nerves, the lingering memory of a man with gray-blue eyes who had once sat in her kitchen and eaten her soup. But the feeling never quite went away. By the time the sun began to set, the festival had reached its peak. Lanterns were lit, and the square glowed warm and golden against the gathering dark. A fiddler struck up a tune, and the villagers formed a ragged circle, dancing with the ungraceful joy of people who had worked hard all year and intended to enjoy their one night of pleasure. Maggie danced with old Marta, then with the baker, then with a shy young shepherd who stepped on her feet 3 times and apologized so profusely that she took pity on him and pretended she had not noticed. Anne danced with anyone who would take her, her small hands gripping the fingers of farmers and their wives, her laughter rising above the music like a bell. And on the ridge above, William watched and did not move. Cedric had ridden down to the village an hour ago to buy bread, a small errand, but it gave the king a moment alone with his thoughts. He watched Maggie spin in the lantern light, her hair coming loose from its pins, her face bright with a smile she did not know he could see. He had no right to be here, he knew to that
Thinked. He had sent her away for her own safety, had drawn the line between them with the cold formality of a royal decree. He had no right to sit on this hillside and drink in the sight of her like a man dying of thirst, and yet he could not make himself leave. It was nearly full dark when the dancing ended and the villagers began to drift toward their homes, lanterns bobbing like fireflies along the paths. Maggie gathered Anne, who was half asleep and clinging to her mother's skirt, and began the walk back to their cottage. William watched them go, his heart a dull ache in his chest. He would wait until they were safe inside, he told himself. Then he would ride back to the capital, back to the court, back to the cold stone walls of Ravenhall Castle and the waiting eyes of Lord Dryden. He had been so careful. He had kept his distance, kept his silence, kept his promise to protect them by staying away. But then he saw it, glinting in the lantern light at the edge of the field where he had dismounted to stretch his legs, a flash of dark wool half buried in the turned earth. He dismounted and walked toward it, his boots sinking into the soft soil. He bent and picked it up. It was a cloak, heavy and worn, the wool coarse and familiar. He knew it at once, knew the stitching, knew the faded mark sewn into the collar. It was a soldier's cloak, issued from the royal armory, the same pattern that had been given to every infantryman in the king's army for the past 20 years. The same cloak he had handed to a young man with tired eyes and a shy smile, at the gates of Ravenhall Castle the week before the Thornwood raid, Maggie's husband, Thomas. William stood there in the darkness holding the cloak, and for a long moment he could not breathe. It had been his gift, his responsibility, his burden. He had given that cloak to a man who had gone to war and never come home, and he had spent 30 years trying to forget the weight of such gifts. The cloak was worn red at the elbows. It had been washed so many times the color had faded to a soft gray, but it had been mended with care, small careful stitches in a neat hand, and the mark of the royal armory still stood clear against the collar. She had kept it. All these years, through widowhood and poverty and the slow grind of survival, she had kept this cloak, and she had mended it with her own hands. William heard a sound escape his throat, something between a breath and a wound, and he pressed the cloak to his chest, the way he had pressed her letter 1,000 times since it had arrived. He understood now, with a clarity that cut through the gray fog of his own fear, that he had been a coward. He had told himself he was protecting them, but the truth was simpler and uglier, and it sat in his chest like a stone. He had been afraid to lose them, and so he had chosen not to have them at all. On the path below, Maggie stopped. She had felt it again, that prickling at the back of her neck, stronger now, almost like a touch. She turned and looked up at the ridge.
There was a figure there, dark against the last pale strip of sky, a man on horseback, his cloak stirring in the wind. He was too far away to see clearly, but she knew him. She knew him the way she knew the shape of a scar on a face she had once tended in her own kitchen. Anne stirred against her, mumbling something about her stone. "Shh, love, we are almost home." But Maggie did not move. She stood in the middle of the path, holding her sleeping daughter, and watched the figure on the ridge until the last light faded and he was swallowed by the dead thing. Then she turned and walked the rest of the way home, the weight of her daughter in her arms, and the memory of a man she had sent a letter to and never heard back from, burning in her chest. When she reached the cottage, she set Anne down on her pallet and tucked the worn blanket around her. The girl was already asleep, her hand curled around the small, heart-shaped stone she had found in the river weeks ago. Maggie knelt beside her daughter and looked at the stone. Anne had said it was lucky. Anne had said she was saving it for the king. Maggie thought of the figure on the ridge. She thought of the cloak hanging in her cupboard, worn thin by years, mended with love. She did not know what it meant. She did not know why her heart was beating so fast. But she knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones like the first frost of winter, that the man on the ridge had not been a stranger passing through, and she knew that she had to see him again. On the ridge, William folded the cloak carefully and tucked it into his saddlebag. He did not look back at the village. He did not allow himself that luxury. But his hand went to his tunic, to the letter pressed against his heart, and he held it there for a long moment before he mounted his horse and rode into the night. Behind him, the lights of Ashford village glowed warm and small, and then, one by one, they went out, until there was nothing but the dark and the cold and the long road back to the capital. The hail was colder than it had any right to be in autumn. William stood at the head of the council table, his hands resting on the worn oak, and listened to the words that had been building for weeks like storm clouds on a distant horizon. "Your Majesty has been absent from the capital on 9 occasions in the past month," Dryden said, his voice smooth as river stone. He did not stand. He did not need to. The other council members sat in silence, their eyes fixed on the table, on their hands, anywhere but on the king. 9 occasions. Each time your guard was reduced. Each time you rode into the countryside without escort, without explanation, without regard for the safety of the crown. William said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence could be a fortress, and he had been living inside it for 30 years. "These are not the actions of a king who is well," Dryden continued, and there was something almost gentle in his tone, which made it worse. "These are the actions of a man who is troubled, a man who has lost his way. The kingdom of Eldmoor cannot afford a king who wanders." Sir Cedric shifted behind William's shoulder. The big soldier's jaw was tight, but he knew his place. He knew that a king must answer for himself, or not at all. William lifted his eyes and looked at Dryden. The man was younger than him by a decade, with the sharp features of old nobility and the soft hands of someone who had never held a sword in anger. He had been a loyal adviser once. William remembered that. He remembered a lot of things that no one else seemed to remember anymore. "You speak of the crown," William said quietly, "but you do not speak of the people who wear it. You do not speak of the roads I traveled, or the villages I passed, or the faces of the farmers who looked at me and did not know who I was." Dryden's smile was thin. "And that is precisely the problem, Your Majesty. A king who is not recognized is a king who is not feared. And a king who is not feared is not a king at all," William finished. He nodded slowly. "I have heard this argument before. I heard it 30 years ago, when I was young and believed that fear was the only language power understood." The room went very still. Even Dryden's practiced composure flickered for a moment. 30 years ago. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had never quite gone out. William did not elaborate. He had never elaborated, not in all the years since. The council knew the shape of the tragedy, the fire, the deaths, the lockdown, but they did not know the details, and he had made certain they never would. "I am not asking for your approval," Dryden said, recovering. "I am informing you that the Regency Council will convene next week to discuss the stability of the throne." "Discuss it then." William turned and walked toward the door. "I have nothing to hide from my own council." But as he walked, he felt the weight of their eyes on his back, and he knew that Dryden had chosen his moment well, the king who wandered, the king who could not be found in his own castle, the king who had been found tied to a tree in a forest by a child. The story had spread, of course. It always did. By now every noble in Eldmoor had heard the version that suited them best. Some laughed, some whispered, some sharpened their knives. William did not care about any of them. He cared about one thing only, and it was not the throne. He cared about the fact that it had been 7 days since he had seen the lights of Ashford village go out, one by one behind his horse's hooves. 7 days since he had held the worn, mended cloak in his hands and felt the years of careful stitching under his fingertips. 7 days since he had been a coward and ridden away. In the village, the leaves had turned fully gold and begun to fall. Maggie stood at her washing bench, wringing out a length of linen, her arms red from the cold water. The rhythm of her work was a kind of prayer, a way of keeping her hands busy while her mind wandered where it should not. She had not told anyone about the man on the ridge. She had not told old Marta, though the old woman's eyes had followed her for days with that knowing look. She had not told Anne, though Anne had asked twice why Mamma was staring at the hills. She had not even told herself, not really. But the cloak was gone from her cupboard, and she had not been able to sleep properly since the night she found it missing. She knew where it had gone. She knew who had taken it, and she did not know what to do with the knowing. "Mama?" Anne's voice came from the doorway, small and insistent. "Mama? I found another one." Maggie turned, drying her hands on her apron. Her daughter stood in the doorway, holding up a small, flat stone. It was shaped like a heart, smooth and gray, and Anne's eyes were shining with the particular joy she reserved for her most precious finds. "That's beautiful, love," Maggie said, crouching down. "Where did you find it?" "By the old oak tree, where the man was tied up." Anne turned the stone over in her small hands. "I'm going to give this one to him." Something closed in Maggie's chest. To whom? Anne. To the king, the sad one. Anne looked up at her mother with a certainty that made Maggie's breath catch. "He needs it more than I do. His eyes are the color of this stone, Mama. Did you see? They are the same color. And they are so, so sad." Maggie did not know what to say. She had not told Anne that the man on the ridge was the king. She had not told her anything, because she had not known how to explain a thing she did not understand herself. But Anne had always seen more than other children. Anne had always found the heart of things easy, think when it was buried deep. "Maybe," Maggie said slowly, "we will see him again someday, and you can give it to him then." "When?" Anne asked. Maggie opened her mouth to answer, but old Marta's voice cut through from the path behind the cottage. "Maggie! Maggie Ashford! You come here this instant!" The old woman's voice was sharp with something Maggie had never heard in it before. Fear. Maggie stood, lifting Anne to her hip without thinking, and hurried around the side of the cottage. Old Marta stood by the fence, her face pale, a folded piece of parchment clutched in her gnarled hand. "What is it?" Maggie asked. "What's happened?" Old Marta's mouth worked for a moment before the words came out. "The council. They're moving against him. They're saying he's unfit, that he wanders, that he's lost his mind." She held up the parchment. "My nephew in the capital sent word. They're going to force him to step down, or worse." Maggie felt the ground shift under her feet. She set Anne down gently, her hand finding the fence for support. "Why would they do that?" she heard herself ask. "He's a good king, He's a broken one," old Marta said, and there was a sorrow in her voice that made Maggie look at her sharply. 30 years, Maggie. 30 years he's carried that fire in his chest, and it's burned him hollow. They see the hollow now, and they think it's weakness." "What fire?" Maggie asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. Old Marta looked at her for a long moment. Then, she let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep, somewhere old and scarred. "Come inside," she said. "Sit down. It's time you knew." The cottage was small, but old Marta's presence filled it like smoke from a hearth fire. She sat in Maggie's chair, her hands wrapped around a cup of honey-tea, and she did not speak for a long time. Anne had been sent to the garden to pick the last of the autumn marigolds. Through the window, Maggie could see her small figure bending over the flower bed, her golden curls bright in the afternoon light. The Thornwood estate, old Marta said at last, was not always in the capital. It was a country manor, east of here, in the hills above the river. Beautiful place. William grew up there. His first wife, Eleanor, she loved the gardens. Maggie sat very still. She had heard of the king's first wife, everyone had, but only in the vaguest terms. A tragedy, a fire. The names had never been spoken aloud in her hearing. They had a daughter, old Marta continued. A little girl. She would have been about Anne's age. Her voice cracked, just slightly. Her name was Rosalind. Maggie's hand went to her mouth. It was harvest time, same as now. William was away. There was a border dispute he had to ride out. He left the estate well guarded. He thought it was safe. Old Marta shook her head slowly. But there was a man, a steward, who had been dismissed for stealing. He wanted revenge. He set the fire in the night, when the guards were changing. The fire. Maggie thought of the old stories, the whispers she had heard as a child, the great blaze that had lit the sky like a second dawn, the bodies that had been found in the morning. Eleanor got Rosalind out of the nursery, old Marta said. She carried her down the servants' stairs, but the smoke was too thick, she could not see. She fell. Maggie could not breathe. They found them at the bottom of the stairs. The mother was still holding the child. She had wrapped her own body around her, trying to shield her from the flames. Old Marta's eyes were wet. They were both gone by the time William
Cook Think I am reached the estate. He rode so hard his horse died under him. He ran through the burning hall, calling their names, until his men pulled him out. The scar, Maggie thought. The scar on his face, from his brow to his cheekbone. The fire? It was from the fire. He gave the order to seal the gates, old Marta said quietly. He was told that the man who set the fire had been seen fleeing toward the village. He ordered the gates closed, the roads watched. He wanted to catch him. He wanted to make him pay. They caught him, Maggie said. It was not a question. They caught him, but it took them 3 days. And in those 3 days the fire spread to the hills. The village below the estate, half of it burned. People lost their homes. A shepherd and his son were trapped in a barn. They died. Old Marta's voice dropped to a whisper. The man they caught in the end was not the man who set the fire. It was a farmer who had been trying to help put it out. He was running because he was afraid. They hanged him before they learned the truth. Maggie felt tears on her face. She had not realized she was crying. William never forgave himself, old Marta said, for the lockdown, for the innocent man, for the village that burned while he chased revenge. He carried that guilt on top of the grief, and broke something in him. He has never let anyone close since. He has never allowed himself to love again, because he believes that anyone he loves will burn. The fire that never died, Maggie thought, the fire that never died. She understood now. She understood the sadness in his eyes, the way he had looked at Anne as if she were something both precious and terrifying. She understood why he had ridden away from the ridge instead of coming down to the village. She understood why he had built his walls so high and so thick. He was not cold. He was not cool. He was a man who had been burned, and he had spent 30 years making sure he would never have to feel the flames again. "Marta," Maggie said, and her voice came out steady, though her heart was shaking. "What is happening to him now? What are they going to do?" Old Marta looked at her, and there was something like hope in her old eyes. "They're going to try to take the throne from him. They're going to call him unfit, too broken, too sad, too weak to rule. And he is so broken, Maggie, that he might let them. He might just walk away because he thinks he deserves it." Maggie stood up. Her legs felt weak, but she stood. "Where is he?" "He's in the capital, in the castle." Old Marta frowned. "Why? What are you thinking?" Maggie did not answer. She walked to the window and looked out at her daughter, who was still picking marigolds, humming a little tune to herself. Anne had a pocket full of stones and a heart too big for her small body, and she believed that even kings could be saved by a lucky rock.
And Maggie thought, maybe she was right. Maybe the king did not need a council to save him. Maybe he did not need an army or a regency or a political victory. Maybe he needed someone to show him that the fire had gone out long ago, that the ash had grown into grass, that there was still green and growth and life waiting for him on the other side of the wall he had built. She turned back to old Marta. "I'm going to the capital," she said. "I'm going to see him." Old Marta stared at her. "Maggie, you can't just walk into the castle and demand to see the king. They'll throw you out. They might throw you in the dungeons." "Maybe," Maggie said, "but I have to try." She went to the door and called out to Anne. Thornwood's daughter looked up, her arms full of bright orange flowers, her smile wide and uncomplicated. "We're going on a trip, love," Maggie said. "We're going to see the sad king." Anne's eyes went wide. "Really? Can I bring my stones?" "Bring them all," Maggie said. "Every single one." That night, while Anne slept with her bag of stones beside her, Maggie sat at the table and wrote a letter. It was not a long letter. She was not a woman of many words, and she had never learned the art of pretty speech. She wrote, "I know about the fire. I know about the lockdown. I know about the man who was hanged, and the shepherd, and the village that burned. I know you think you deserve to be alone. You are wrong. Your daughter would have wanted you to live. She would have wanted you to let someone in. I am coming to the capital. You do not have to see me, but if you do, I will be the one who does not look away." She folded the letter and tucked it into her dress, next to her heart. In the morning, she packed a small bundle, a loaf of bread, a piece of cheese, Anne's spare dress, and the last of the marigolds. She checked the latch on the cottage door. She looked back at the garden, at the washing line, at the small life she had built from grief and stubbornness and love. Then she took Anne's hand, and they walked out of Ashford Village together, toward the capital, toward the man who had been birding for 30 years and did not know how to let the fire go out. "Are we going to save him, Mama?" Anne asked, skipping along the road, her stones rattling in her pocket. "Yes, love," Maggie said. "I think we are." And she held her daughter's hand tighter, and she walked. The road to the capital was a long gray ribbon, and Anne's legs were short. They walked through the morning and into the afternoon, stopping only when the child's feet grew too sore to carry her. Maggie lifted her daughter onto her hip, shifted the bundle on her shoulder, and kept walking. The marigolds in her pocket had wilted by the time the walls of Ravenhall rose against the pale autumn sky. She had never been inside the castle. She had seen it from the village, a dark shape on the hill, always distant, always watching. Now it loomed over her, stone and iron and the cold weight of power. She stopped at the gate, her breath short, her hands trembling around Anne's small fingers. A guard stepped forward, his face hard. "State your business." Maggie opened her mouth, but no words came. She had no title, no summons, no reason to be here except a letter she had written in the dark and a feeling she could not name. "I am Margaret Ashford," she said finally. "From Ashford Village. I am here to see the king." The guard laughed. It was not a kind laugh. "The king does not receive washerwomen." "Please," she said, her voice smaller than she wanted. "I need to see him. He knows me. "Move along," the guard said, already turning away. Anne tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mama, maybe we should have brought him a gift. Like the stones. Everyone likes gifts." Before Maggie could answer, a voice cut through the gate-yard, sharp, familiar, edged with iron. "Let her pass." She knew that voice. She had heard it in her cottage, low and rough with fever. She had heard it in the orchard, soft in the dark. She had heard it in her dreams, calling her name like a question he was afraid to ask. Sir Cedric stepped out of the shadow of the gatehouse, his face as unreadable as ever. He looked at her for a long moment, then at Anne, then back at her. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or something slipped loose to relief. "You came," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, then turned and walked through the gate. "Follow me." The castle was a maze of stone corridors and cold air. Maggie held Anne's hand tightly, her eyes drinking in the tapestries and the torches and the silent men in armor who watched them pass. She felt small here, smaller than she had ever felt in her life. but she kept walking. They stopped before a heavy oak door. Sir Cedric turned to face her, his voice low. "The king has not left his chambers in 3 days. He has not eaten, he has not spoken to anyone except me, and that was only to ask if you had arrived." Maggie's chest tightened. "He knew I was coming?" "Your letter reached him yesterday evening. He read it twice. Then he sat down in the chair by the window and did not move again." Sir Cedric's jaw tightened. "I do not know what you wrote, but I have served him for 20 years, and I have never seen him look the way he looked when he read it." He pushed the door open and stepped aside. Maggie stood on the threshold. The room beyond was dim, lit only by the pale light of the dying afternoon. A fire crackled low in the hearth, and there, in a high-backed chair by the window, sat the King of Eldmoor. He looked nothing like the man she had nursed back to health. That man had been feverish and vulnerable, stripped of his crown and his armor. This man was hollow. His face was grey, his eyes sunken, his hands limp on the arms of the chair. The scar on his face seemed deeper than she remembered, a pale river running through the ruin of his expression. He did not look up when she entered. "William," she said softly. His hands tightened on the chair. "You should not have come." "I know," she said. "I came anyway." She crossed the cream slowly, her footsteps soft on the stone. Anne followed, quiet for once, her small hand gripping her mother's skirt. Maggie stopped beside the chair and looked down at him. He looked older, broken, in a way she had never seen him broken before. When she had found him tied to that tree, he had been angry, defiant, fighting even in his helplessness. Now he sat like a man who had forgotten how to fight. "The letter," he said, his voice rough. "You said you would not look away." "I meant it. I am not worth looking at." He finally raised his eyes to hers, and she saw something she had never seen in them before. Not anger, not grief, but a vast and terrible emptiness, like a field after a fire. "You do not know what I have done." "I know," she said quietly. "Old Marta told me. About the fire, about Eleanor, about Rosalind." His breath caught. The name seemed to cut him open. He closed his eyes, and for a long moment he did not speak. "Then you know," he said finally, "that I am a murderer." Maggie knelt beside his chair. She did not touch him, but she was close enough to feel the heat of his grief. "You gave an order," she said. "You did not light the fire." "I might as well have. I was the one who closed the gates. I was the one who ordered the village searched, house by house, man by man. I told them to find the ones who did it, and I did not care how they found them." His voice cracked. "They dragged Thomas from his cottage. They said he had been seen near the manor that night. They said he was one of them." Maggie went very still. "Thomas? Your husband?" William's eyes opened and they were wet. "He was one of the first they took. I did not know him. I did not ask. I was drowning in my own grief, and I did not care who else drowned with me. I signed the order for Hogwarts thing to execution without reading his name." The world tilted around her. She felt her hands go cold, felt the breath leave her body, felt the stone floor hard beneath her knees. Her husband, her Thomas, the man who had laughed in the garden and carved wooden birds for his daughter and held her hand at night when the grief was too much to bear. The man they had told her died in a skirmish, the man she had mourned for 3 years. "William," she whispered. "I did not know," he said, and the words were broken, torn out of him one by one. "I did not know who he was. I did not know he had a wife. I did not know he had a daughter. I found out later, much later, when it was too late to undo it. I found out his name, and I found out about you, and I have carried it every day since." He looked at her, and there was nothing left in his eyes but the truth. "I wrote to you. I sent a letter, offering compensation, explaining what had happened, but I could not bear to sign it with my name. I sent it anonymously, from the Crown. I thought if you did not know, it would be easier. For you. For me." Maggie remembered the letter, the formal words, the cold offer of silver, the official seal of the crown. She had burned it in the hearth the night it arrived, too grief-stricken to read it twice. "I burned it," she said. "I never read your name. I know. I hoped you never would." For a long moment neither of them spoke. The fire crackled, the shadows lengthened, and Anne, who had been standing very still by her mother's side, stepped forward. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the heart-shaped stone. It was warm from her small hand, smooth and grey-blue, like the color of his eyes. She held it up to him. "Do you want my stone?" she asked. "It's lucky. It will bring you good tea."
"Sings!" William stared at her. His mouth opened, but no sound came. "It's for you," Anne said, pressing it into his hand. "I found it by the river. It looked like your eyes. Mama said you were sad, and I thought if you had a lucky stone, you wouldn't be sad anymore." His hand closed around the stone. His whole body shook. And then, slowly, the King of Eldmoor, the man who had conquered armies, who had ruled for 30 years, who had not shed a tear in public since the day his daughter was laid in the ground, began to cry. He did not sob. He did not make a sound. The tears simply slid down his face, one after another, as if a dam had finally broken and the water was too old to rush. He bowed his head, and his shoulders shook, and the stone fell from his hand and rolled across the floor. Maggie caught it. She picked it up from his grip and pressed it back into his palm. "Hold it," she said softly. "Let it work." He looked at her through his tears. "How can you stand to look at me after what I did to your husband?" "Because I know what grief does to a man," she said. "I know what it makes you do. I have spent 3 years wishing I had been there the day Thomas died, wishing I could have saved him, wishing I had said something different, done something different, been something different. I know what it is to carry a guilt you cannot put down." She reached out and took his hand, the hand that held the stone, the hand that held 30 years of sorrow. "Thomas was a good man. He would not have wanted me to hate you. He would have wanted me to forgive you. And I think, if he could see us now, he would tell you to put the guilt down, to let it go, to live." William's hand tightened around hers. His voice was barely a whisper. "I do not know how." "Then let me show you," she said, and then, very gently, she pulled him forward. He did not resist. He let go of the chair, let go of the weight he had carried for so long, and let himself fall into her arms. She held him, this great broken man, his face buried in her shoulder, his tears soaking into her dress. Anne watched for a moment. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her small arms around both of them, her head pressed against her mother's side. "It's okay," Anne said, her voice muffled. "The stone will make it better. It always works." William laughed, a broken, watery sound, half sob, half relief. He pulled back, just enough to look at Anne, and she saw that his eyes were the color of the stone in his hand. "Thank you," he said, and the words were so quiet, so raw, so completely stripped of the armor he had worn for 30 years that Maggie felt her own eyes sting. "Thank you, little one." Anne beamed. "You're welcome, King William. Can we be friends now?" He looked from Anne to Maggie, and something shifted in his face. The emptiness was gone. In its place was something fragile and new, something that had been buried so deep it had nearly forgotten how to grow. "Yes," he said, his voice rough. "I would like that very much." Outside the window, the sun was setting over Ravenhall, painting the sky in shade of gold and rose. And inside the room, the King of Eldmoor sat on the floor with a washerwoman and her daughter, holding a heart-shaped stone in his hand, learning, for the first time in 30 years, how to let himself be loved. The news of Lord Dryden's banishment reached Ashford village on a grey morning, carried by a peddler who had passed through Ravenhall on his way south. The king, it was said, had stood before the full court and pronounced the sentence himself. Not dead, though the law allowed it.
Not even imprisonment, banishment to the northern reaches, where the land was hard and the winters unforgiving. Old Marta clicked her tongue when she heard it, setting down her jug of honey mead on Maggie's worn wooden table. "Mark my words," she said, shaking her head slowly. 10 years ago, William would have had that man's head on a pike before the sun set. Something has changed in him. Maggie said nothing. She was mending a tear in Anne's winter cloak, her needle moving in even, practiced strokes. But her hands paused for just a moment, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. She knew what had changed. She had seen it with her own eyes. In a candlelit room at the top of a tower, when a king had sat on the floor and held a child's stone in his hand as if it were made of gold. The days passed, autumn bled into the first gray whispers of winter, and the village settled into the quiet rhythm of harvest's end. Maggie returned to her washing, to the river and the cold water and the ache in her knuckles. But something was different now. She would catch herself humming as she worked, the old folk songs rising unbidden to her lips. She would look up from her tub of linens and watch the road that led north, toward the castle, and she would wonder. Anne noticed, of course. Children always notice everything. "Mama," she said one evening, looking up from the collection of stones she had spread across the floor, "is the king coming to see us?" Maggie's needle paused mid-stitch. "I don't know, love. Why do you ask?" Anne shrugged, her small shoulders lifting under her patched dress. "Because you keep looking at the road, and because I gave him my lucky stone." "Lucky stones always come back," she said it with absolute certainty, the unshakable logic of a 6-year-old who had decided how the world worked. Maggie smiled and went back to her mending. But that night, after Anne was asleep, she took down the old cloak from its peg by the door. She had kept it all these years. Thomas's cloak, heavy gray wool, worn thin at the elbows. She had washed it 100 times, had mended the torn hem twice, had buried her face in it on the nights when grief was too sharp to bear alone. It smelled of nothing now. Not him, not the wood smoke of their old cottage, just clean wool, worn soft by years of faithful service. She had told William the truth in that tower room. She had burned the letter. She had never read it, never known the words of apology that a king had written but lacked the courage to sign. But she had kept the cloak. And now, holding it in her hands, she understood something she had not fully understood before. The cloak was not just a piece of cloth. It was proof that Thomas had lived, that he had loved, that he had marched away from her with a promise to return. And somewhere in the cold corridors of Ravenhall Castle, a man who had once signed a death warrant had been carrying the same weight of grief for 30 years. She folded the cloak carefully and placed it back on its peg. Then she sat down by the fire and waited, though she could not have said what she was waiting for. He came on the first day of winter. The village was quiet, the fields empty, the smoke from chimneys hanging low in the cold air. Maggie was at the river, beating a stubborn stain out of a merchant's shirt, when she heard the sound of hooves on the frozen road. She looked up, and there he was. William had come without ceremony, without the banners and trumpets that usually announced the arrival of a key. Fate, think. He rode alone, dressed in simple traveling clothes, his gray-streaked hair uncovered by any crown. Sir Cedric followed at a respectful distance, but the king himself rode ahead, his eyes scanning the village until they found her. Maggie's hands went still in the cold water. He dismounted and walked toward her, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. The scar on his face stood out pale in the winter light, and his breath rose in clouds around his head. He stopped a few paces from her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the heart-shaped stone. "I've been carrying it," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been embarrassment. "Anne gave it to me, and I didn't want to put it down. It's strange. I've commanded armies, I've held kingdoms together with my bare hands, and I can't seem to let go of a child's stone." Maggie laughed, a soft sound that surprised her. She has that effect on people. She does. He looked down at the stone in his palm, turning it over. "I came to see you. Both of you. I wanted to bring the stone back, but—" He paused, and something shifted in his gray-blue eyes. "I think I'd rather keep it, if she'll let me." "She'll let you," Maggie said. "She told me lucky stones always come back." They stood there in the cold, the river whispering past them, and something passed between them that neither had words for. It was not quite love, not yet. It was something older and more fragile, understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of trust. "Dryden is gone," William said after a while. "I sent him north, Some will say I was weak, that I should have made an example of him. He looked at her, and his voice was quiet. But I've spent 30 years making examples of PM. Dilt Paggy. I've killed more men than I can count, and I'm tired of it. I'm tired of being the man who signs the orders and never lets himself feel the weight of them. Maggie stepped out of the river, her feet numb with cold, and stood before him. She was a head shorter than him, a washerwoman in a patched dress, her hands red and chapped from the freezing water. But she looked up at him without fear, the way she had looked at him that first morning in the forest, when he was just a wounded stranger bound to a tree. "You learned," she said softly. "That's what matters. You learned to feel the weight." He stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly he reached out and took her hand. His palm was broad and calloused, warm against her cold skin. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The gesture itself was enough. They walked back to the cottage together, William leading his horse, Maggie carrying her bundle of wet laundry. Anne burst out of the door before they reached it, her face bright with joy. "King William!" she shouted, and she launched herself at him without hesitation. William caught her, lifting her easily into his arms, and for a moment his face was unguarded, open, almost soft. "Hello, little one. I brought back your stone." "I told you," Anne said, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Lucky stones always come back." She pulled back and looked at him with serious eyes. "Did you keep it safe?" "I did. I kept it right here." He touched his chest where the stone rested in a small leather pouch against his heart. Anne nodded, satisfied. "Good. Now you have to come see my new stones. I found a really shiny one yesterday, and I think it might be a dragon's tooth. Do you want to see?" "I'll show you, but you have to promise not to tell anyone because dragons can't. Secret." William looked over Anne's head at Maggie, and there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Wonder, perhaps, or the first stirrings of a hope he had long believed dead. "I promise," he said gravely. "Show me your dragon's tooth." The days that followed were strange and bright, like sunlight through frost. William did not return to Ravenhall. He sent word, through Sir Cedric, that he was undertaking a personal tour of the northern villages, and that the court was to manage without him for a while, and he stayed. He stayed because Anne needed someone to help her build a fort out of firewood. He stayed because Maggie's roof had a leak in the corner that he could fix with his own hands. He stayed because for the first time in 30 years, the silence of a simple cottage did not feel like a prison. He learned the rhythms of their lives. He discovered that Maggie hummed when she was nervous and sang when she was happy. He learned that Anne would eat almost anything if it was served with honey, and that she fell asleep instantly if someone told her a story about dragons. He learned that old Marta's honey mead was in fact mostly honey and very little mead, and that she would take offense if you did not drink at least 3 cups. And somewhere in the quiet weeks, he began to heal. It happened slowly, in the small moments, the way Maggie would leave a cup of hot tea by his chair without being asked, the way Anne would climb into his lap and demand a story, her small body warm and trusting against his chest. The way the cottage, once so foreign to him, began to feel like a place he belonged. One evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall, he found the old cloak. It was hanging on its peg by the door, and he recognized it immediately. He had a Chan cloak, seen 100 such cloaks in his life. Army issue, the same grey wool issued to every soldier in the Eldmoor forces. But he knew, somehow, that this one had belonged to Thomas Ashford. He reached out and touched the worn fabric. It was soft, washed 1,000 times, the wool thin at the elbows. There was a patch on the left shoulder, neatly sewn, and he traced it with his fingers. "Thomas wore that," Maggie said from behind him. He turned. She was standing in the doorway of the bedroom, Anne asleep in the next room, the firelight casting shadows across her face. "I know," he said. His voice was thick. "I remember the day these were issued. It was the last batch before the march." He paused, his hand still resting on the cloak. "He was a good man, Maggie. I never knew him, but I know he must have been, because he married you. And he made this child who has more courage than half my court." Maggie crossed the room and stood beside him.
Together they looked at the old grey cloak, this relic of a man who had died for a mistake a king had made. "I was so angry for so long," she said quietly. "Not at anyone in particular, just at the world, at fate, at whatever force had taken him from me. I didn't know who to blame. So I blamed everyone. I blamed the war, the commanders, the king who had ordered the march." She smiled, a small, sad smile. "And it turns out I had every right to blame you." William's hand fell from the cloak. He turned to face her, and the weight of his guilt was written plainly on his face. "Yes," he said, "you did, and I would understand if you never forgave me." Maggie reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers brushing the old scar that ran from his brow to his cheekbone. "I found something," she said softly, "when I came to the castle. I found in a man
who had spent 30 years punishing himself for a mistake he made in grief. And I found that I couldn't hate him. I couldn't even be angry at him." She smiled, and this time the smile was warm. "Because I know what it is to lose the person you love most in the world. And I know that you don't make good decisions when you're drowning in that kind of pain." He closed his eyes, and she felt him tremble under her hand. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For Thomas. For your grief. For all the years you spent alone because of my mistake. Thank you," she said. "That's all I needed. Not the letter, not the explanation, just the words." He opened his eyes, and there were tears in them. "I don't know how to do this," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to be this. To let people in, to trust that they won't leave. I've been alone for so long." "Then don't do it alone," she said. "Let me help you." The winter deepened, but the cottage grew warmer. On the morning of the solstice, the shortest day of the year, William took Anne to the cliffs above the river. The snow had stopped, and the world was white and still, the air crisp and clear. Anne held his hand as they walked, chattering about the dragons that she was certain lived in the caves below. "King William," she said, tugging at his sleeve, "you promised you would find me a dragon's tooth. Remember? You promised." William smiled, the smile that came easier now. "I remember, little one, and I keep my promises." He led her to the edge of the cliff, where the wind was sharp, and the sea stretched grey and endless beyond the frozen fields. And there, half buried in the snow, he found it. It was a fossil, ancient and beautiful, a long, spiraled shape that might have been the tooth of some creature from before memory. He picked it up and brushed the snow from it, and it gleamed in the winter light. "Is that it?" Anne breathed, her eyes wide. "Is that a real dragon's tooth?" "It is," William said, and he meant it. "I've been searching for it for a long time. I think I was waiting for the right person to give it to." He knelt in the snow and held out the fossil. Anne took it with both hands, her face lit with wonder, and for a moment she was too awed to speak. "Thank you, King William," she said finally. "This is the best thing I ever got. I'm going to keep it forever." She threw her arms around his neck, and William held her, kneeling in the snow on the edge of the world, and he thought that this must be what happiness felt like. Spring came to Ashford Village, soft and green and full of new life. The snow melted, the river swelled, and the world woke from its long sleep. And on the first warm Sunday of the season, William stood outside the village church and watched the small congregation file out into the sunlight. He had attended the service, sitting in the back pew, and he had listened to the old priest speak of mercy and forgiveness and the power of love to heal old wounds. And he had thought, with wonder, that he understood now. He understood what the words meant, not in his head, but in his heart. Maggie came out of the church, Anne's hand in hers, and she smiled when she saw him. It was the smile she wore when she was truly happy, the one that reached her eyes and warmed her whole face. "King William," Anne said, running to him. "Did you see the flowers on the altar?" "I put them there. I picked them myself." "I saw them," he said, lifting her up. "They were beautiful, almost as beautiful as you." Anne giggled and hugged him, then squirmed to be put down so she could chase a butterfly across the churchyard. William watched her go, and then he turned to Maggie. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, "this winter, thinking about who I was and who I want to be."
Maggie stood beside him, her shoulder almost touching his. "And what did you decide?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small crown made of dried dandelions. It was faded now, the yellow blooms turned to white fluff, but it was beautifully made, woven together with care. "Anne gave this to me," he said. "The first time I visited the cottage, she put it on my head and told me I was the best king ever." He smiled, a soft, self-deprecating smile. "I've kept it in my pocket ever since. I know it's silly, a king carrying around a crowd of weeds." "I don't think it's silly," Maggie said softly. "No," he agreed. "I don't think it is either." He turned to face her fully, and his gray-blue eyes were steady and clear. "Maggie, I've spent 30 years learning how to be a king. I've learned how to command armies, how to manage a court, how to make decisions that affect thousands of lives. But I never learned how to be a father. I never learned how to be a husband. I never learned how to love someone without being afraid." Her breath caught. "William." "Let me finish," he said, and there was something almost pleading in his voice. "I want to learn. I want to learn how to be the kind of man who deserves you, who deserves her." He nodded toward Anne, who was still chasing butterflies, her laughter ringing across the churchyard. "I know I'm not young. I know I have scars, and a past, and more mistakes than I can count, but I also know that I love you, Maggie. And I love that little girl with your heart and your courage, and her impossible belief in lucky stones." He held out the crown of dandelions. "I don't have a ring to give you. I didn't think to bring one, but I have this, and I have a kingdom, and I have the rest of my life, and I want to spend it learning how to love you." Maggie looked at the crown and then at him, and her eyes filled with tears. She reached out and took the small, faded crown, turning it over in her hands. "You know," she said, her voice trembling, "I never thought I would love again. I thought my heart had closed itself forever when Thomas died. But then you came, and you were so broken, and so strong, and so afraid, and so brave, all at once. And Anne loved you before I even understood what was happening." She looked up at him, and the tears were falling freely now, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll spend the rest of my life with you, and I'll help you learn how to love." He took her hand, and she stepped closer, and they stood there in the spring sunlight, in the churchyard of a small village, with a 6-year-old girl chasing butterflies, and an old king finally learning to let himself be loved. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "for seeing me, for not turning away." "Thank you," she replied, "for letting me see." And somewhere in the distance Anne's voice rang out, bright and clear. "King William, Mama! I found a new stone. It's the luckiest one yet." William laughed, a real laugh, warm and free. "Coming, little one," he called. "We're coming." He took Maggie's hand and they walked together across the churchyard, toward the child who had changed everything, toward the life they would build together, toward the future that had once seemed impossible. And as they walked, William looked down at the crowd of dandelions in Maggie's hand, and he thought that he had finally found something worth more than any throne. He had found a family, he had found a home, and he had learned, at last, that the greatest strength of a king was not in the power he held, but in the love he was brave enough to accept. Sometimes, the greatest kings are saved not by armies, but by a child's lucky stone and a mother's brave heart. William finally found his true home. Do you believe love can heal the deepest scars? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartwarming stories.